A small girl in threadbare clothes stands outside the gleaming windows of Belmont's, the city's most exclusive restaurant, her stomach growling with hunger. Her desperate plea to the manager seems simple enough. She'll sweep floors, wash dishes, anything for a meal. But as the sneering manager looks down at her dirt-smudged face and worn sneakers, he has no idea who she really is. What happens next will shake this establishment to its core and teach everyone present a lesson they'll never forget. 7-year-old Emma stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue, her small hands pressed against the cool glass of Belmont's front window. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across tables draped in crisp white linen. Well-dressed diners laughed and clinked champagne glasses, completely unaware of the hungry child watching them from the autumn cold outside. Emma's faded blue dress hung loosely on her thin frame, its hem unraveling at the edges. Her once white sneakers were scuffed gray, the left one held together with a carefully tied knot where the lace had broken. Her blonde hair, tangled and uncombed, fell past her shoulders in messy waves that caught the evening breeze. A smudge of dirt marked her left cheek, and her fingernails showed the grime of a child who had been on the streets too long. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a feeling she had learned to recognize over the past several hours. She had been walking since morning, watching the city move around her with indifference. People passed by without seeing her, their eyes sliding over her small form, as if she were invisible. She had learned quickly that poverty made children disappear in plain sight. But Emma was not what she appeared to be. Behind those watchful blue eyes lay a sharp intelligence and a purpose that would soon turn this cold autumn evening into something no one at Belmont's would ever forget. She took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and moved toward the heavy brass-handled door. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. A small girl in threadbare clothes stands outside the gleaming windows of Belmont's, the city's most exclusive restaurant, her stomach growling with hunger. Her desperate plea to the manager seems simple enough. She'll sweep floors, wash dishes, anything for a meal. But as the sneering manager looks down at her dirt-smudged face and worn sneakers, he has no idea who she really is. What happens next will shake this establishment to its core and teach everyone present a lesson they'll never forget. 7-year-old Emma stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, her small frame barely reaching the lower edge of the restaurant's gleaming windows. The faded blue dress she wore hung loosely on her thin shoulders, its fabric worn soft from years of use and washing. The hem had come unstitched in places, revealing frayed threads that brushed against her scraped knees. Her sneakers told their own story of hardship. Once white, they were now a dingy gray, covered in scuff marks and street dirt. The left shoe had a hole near the toe, and both laces were knotted where they had broken and been tied back together. Her small feet shifted uncomfortably in shoes that were slightly too large, probably handed down or found in a donation bin. Emma's blonde hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders, uncombed and knotted in places where a caring hand with a brush had been absent. A smudge of dirt marked her left cheek, and her fingernails showed the grime of someone who had nowhere to wash properly. Her clothes carried the musty smell of fabric that had been worn too long without laundering. But it was her eyes that might have given someone pause, had anyone bothered to look closely. Those blue eyes held something beyond simple hunger or desperation. They watched the scene inside Belmont's with an intensity that seemed unusual for such a young child. Belmont's restaurant rose before her like a palace of warmth and plenty. The building's facade was all polished marble and brass fixtures that gleamed under carefully positioned lights. Through the spotless windows, Emma could see everything she lacked. Elegant diners sat at tables adorned with fresh flowers and flickering candles. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black vests moved smoothly between tables, carrying plates of food that made Emma's stomach clench with longing. A massive crystal chandelier dominated the center of the dining room, its hundreds of facets catching and scattering light like captured stars. The walls were decorated with expensive paintings in gilded frames, and the floors were covered in rich carpet that Emma knew her dirty shoes would never be allowed to touch. Her stomach growled audibly, a sound that seemed loud in her own ears despite the traffic noise of Fifth Avenue. She had not eaten since the previous evening, and that had been only a small portion. The hunger was becoming difficult to ignore, a constant ache that made her feel lightheaded and weak. Emma pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching as a waiter delivered a plate of pasta to a nearby table. Emma's small hand gripped the brass door handle, cool and heavy beneath her fingers. For a moment she hesitated, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Then she thought of her mother's words, spoken just months before her passing, and found her courage. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit her first. A wall of heated air that smelled of expensive food and fresh flowers. Her worn sneakers sank slightly into carpet so thick and plush that she had never felt anything like it. The burgundy fabric beneath her feet probably cost more per square foot than most people spent on rent. Emma's eyes adjusted to the golden light that seemed to pour from everywhere at once. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing reflections across marble columns that rose toward a ceiling painted with elaborate designs. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that required constant attention and considerable expense. The tables were set with more silverware than Emma could identify purposes for, and the wine glasses caught the light like delicate sculptures. She stood just inside the entrance. A small figure of poverty dropped into a world of wealth, and the contrast could not have been more stark. Her dirt-smudged face and tangled hair seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her threadbare dress looked gray and lifeless next to the rich colors surrounding her. Manager Richard Sterling stood near the host station, reviewing the evening's reservation list on a leather-bound folder. He was a man in his mid-40s who carried himself with the bearing of someone who believed his position granted him significance beyond its reality. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, cut to emphasize his slim build and fitted so precisely that not a single wrinkle dared appear. The fabric had the subtle sheen of expensive wool, and his burgundy tie was knotted with mathematical precision. Richard's dark hair was styled with product that kept every strand in its designated place, not one hair out of alignment despite the busy evening. His face had settled into an expression that seemed permanently arranged to communicate superiority. His mouth naturally turned downward at the corners, and his eyes had developed the habit of looking down his straight nose at people, literally and figuratively. He wore gold cufflinks that caught the light when he moved, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. The moment Emma stepped inside, Richard's head turned. His expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession. First came surprise, his eyebrows rising as he registered the unexpected sight of a child entering alone. Then confusion creased his forehead as his mind tried to reconcile her appearance with the restaurant's clientele. Finally, his features arranged themselves into unmistakable disdain, his lips pressing into a thin line of disapproval. His eyes traveled from Emma's tangled hair down to her broken shoes, taking inventory of every sign of poverty with obvious distaste. Around the restaurant, other staff members noticed the disruption to their carefully maintained atmosphere. Jennifer, the hostess in her elegant black dress, stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with a departing couple. Marcus, a waiter carrying a tray of desserts, slowed his steps to stare. A busboy paused in clearing a table, his hands frozen above a stack of plates. Emma walked forward with careful steps, her small feet moving across the plush carpet toward where Richard stood. Despite the intimidating surroundings and the weight of multiple stares upon her, she held her head up and kept her shoulders square. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, a composure unusual for a child who looked as desperate as she did. She stopped a respectful distance from the manager, close enough to speak but not so close as to invade his space, and looked up at him with those watchful blue eyes. Her voice when she spoke was soft but clear, carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "Excuse me, sir. Can I sweep your floor for food?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct. She clasped her small hands in front of her faded dress, waiting for his response with impatience that seemed beyond her years. Richard's expression hardened further, if such a thing were possible. He looked down at Emma the way one might examine something unpleasant tracked in on someone's shoe. His eyes made another slow journey from her tangled hair to her broken sneakers, lingering on every stain and tear with obvious judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with condescension. Sweep the floor? He repeated her words as if they were foreign to him, as if the very concept of what she was suggesting was absurd. How exactly did you get past the doorman, little girl? This is not a public shelter. His tone made it clear he considered her presence a contamination of his carefully maintained establishment. Emma met his gaze steadily, not dropping her eyes despite the clear hostility radiating from the man before her. The doorman was helping someone with their car, sir. I just need something small to eat. I can work for it. I'm good at cleaning. I can sweep, or wash dishes, or wipe tables, whatever you need. Her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, a sound that carried in the suddenly quiet restaurant. Richard's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, more a smirk of satisfaction at having his assumptions confirmed. I see. And tell me, child, do you have any idea what kind of establishment this is? He gestured around the dining room with one manicured hand, his gold cufflink catching the light. Belmont's caters to a very specific clientele. We have standards here. We have expectations. This is not the sort of place where street children come begging. The word begging was delivered with particular emphasis, designed to shame. Emma's hands tightened slightly where they were clasped, but her voice remained steady. I'm not begging, sir. I'm offering to work. There's a difference. I just need a little food, and I'll earn it honestly. Richard's laugh was short and sharp, entirely without humor. Earn it? You think sweeping a floor with those filthy hands would be earning anything? You would likely damage more than you would help. Richard's voice rose in volume, no longer bothering to maintain the quiet professionalism expected of an upscale establishment's manager. He wanted to be heard now, wanted his authority witnessed and acknowledged by everyone present. Perhaps you need to understand something about how the world works, child. This restaurant serves people of quality, people of refinement. He gestured broadly at the dining room, ensuring every table could hear his words. Look at yourself. Look at those rags you're wearing, that dirt on your face, that hair that hasn't seen a brush in who knows how long. Do you honestly think you belong in a place like this? Several diners had stopped eating entirely now, forks suspended halfway to mouths as they watched the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. Others leaned forward with undisguised interest, as if Richard were providing dinner theater along with their meal. Near the host station, Jennifer the hostess exchanged a look with Marcus the waiter, and both struggled to suppress smiles. Jennifer leaned close to Marcus and whispered just loud enough for nearby staff to hear. Can you believe she actually thought she could just walk in here? Like this is some kind of charity kitchen. Marcus snickered quietly, shaking his head. Probably does this at every nice restaurant on the avenue. Works the sympathy angle. Their quiet mockery carried an edge of cruelty that matched their manager's more direct assault. Richard continued his speech, warming to his theme now that he had an audience. Belmont's has maintained its reputation for 37 years by understanding something fundamental. There are certain standards that must be upheld. There are certain classes of people who appreciate fine dining, who understand the unspoken rules of establishments like ours. He straightened his burgundy tie, a gesture that seemed calculated to draw attention to his own polished appearance in contrast to Emma's poverty. And then there are people who simply do not belong in such spaces. People who would drag down the atmosphere, who would make our valued guests uncomfortable with their presence. A woman at table 7 leaned toward her dining companion, her voice carrying in a stage whisper. Poor thing looks absolutely filthy. How did she even get in here? Her companion, a man in an expensive suit, shook his head with disapproval. Security is clearly lacking. We shouldn't have to look at this while we're trying to enjoy our meal. Another diner pulled out her phone, though whether to call someone or simply document the spectacle was unclear. Emma stood through all of this without moving. But her hands had begun to tremble where they remained clasped in front of her. The trembling started in her fingers and spread up through her wrists, a physical manifestation of the emotional assault she was enduring. Yet she did not drop her gaze, did not turn and run, did not give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her completely break. Emma took a slow, steadying breath. The kind of breath someone takes when they need to gather their strength from deep within. When she spoke, her voice remained calm despite the trembling that had spread through her small body. I understand this is a nice restaurant, sir. I'm not trying to cause any problems. I just thought maybe I could help with something. Anything at all. I really am good at cleaning. My mother taught me how to do it properly. There was something in the way she said the word mother, a catch in her voice that suggested a recent loss, a wound still fresh and tender. Near the kitchen entrance, a young woman in a server's uniform watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Sarah was only 19, new to Belmont's and still learning the unspoken hierarchies and expectations of upscale dining. She had taken this job to help pay for community college classes, and she understood what it meant to struggle, to count every dollar, to wonder where the next meal might come from. Her dark eyes moved from Richard's sneering face to Emma's trembling form, and something in her chest tightened with recognition and sympathy. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to intervene, but afraid of the consequences from her manager. Richard's expression twisted into something uglier, his professional mask slipping to reveal the cruelty beneath. "Oh, your mother taught you, did she? Tell me, child, is this her idea? Send the little one in looking pathetic to tug at heartstrings and scam some free food?" His voice took on a mocking tone, pitched higher in a cruel imitation of childish innocence. "Please, sir, I can clean, I can work. Just give me something to eat. It's quite the performance, I'll grant you that. But I've been in this business for 23 years, and I've seen every con there is." Emma's blue eyes began to shimmer with gathering tears, the moisture catching the light from the chandelier above. The tears pooled along her lower lids, threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back with determination. She would not cry in front of this man, would not give him that victory. "It's not a performance, sir. I really am hungry. I'm not trying to trick anyone." Her voice wavered slightly but held firm. Sarah made a decision. She moved quickly to the beverage station, filled a glass with ice water, and walked toward Emma with deliberate steps. The other staff members watched her with surprise, and Richard's head snapped around as Sarah approached the child. "Here," Sarah said softly, kneeling down slightly to offer the glass to Emma at her level. "You look thirsty." Emma's small hands reached for the glass, wrapping around it with careful gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion at this small kindness in the midst of humiliation. Richard's face flushed with anger, his eyes fixing on Sarah with a look that promised future consequences. Richard's voice rose to a volume that ensured every person in the restaurant could hear him clearly. "Sarah, step away from her this instant. You are encouraging exactly the kind of behavior that we cannot tolerate." His face had taken on a reddish hue, anger and embarrassment mixing in equal measure at having his authority challenged by a junior employee. Sarah straightened slowly, her jaw tight with suppressed words, but she did not take the glass back from Emma. Richard turned his full attention back to the child, and his expression held nothing but contempt. "I am calling security right now. This has gone on long enough. You are a street urchin trying to exploit whatever kindness you think you might find here, and I will not have it." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket with a flourish, holding it up as though it were a weapon. "You people are all the same. You think you can come into places like this, play on sympathies, and walk away with something you haven't earned. Well, not here. Not at Belmont's." Emma's hands tightened around the water glass, and she looked up at Richard with those unnervingly steady blue eyes. Despite everything, despite the public humiliation and the cruel words and the stares of dozens of wealthy diners, she made one final attempt. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but remarkably steady. Each word delivered with simple dignity. "Please, I just need something small to eat." The plea was so simple, so basic, so human, that several diners looked away in discomfort, but Richard seemed to feed off the moment, energized by his audience and his righteous indignation. He straightened to his full height and reached up to adjust his burgundy tie, smoothing it down his chest in a gesture he had perfected over years of asserting his authority. It was his signature movement, the physical manifestation of his power in this small kingdom he ruled. "Let me make something absolutely clear, not just to you but to everyone present," he announced, turning slightly to address the dining room as much as Emma. "Belmont's has standards precisely because we do not bend to every sob story that walks through our doors. If we allowed every vagrant child to come in demanding free food, where would it end? We would be overrun. The integrity of this establishment depends on maintaining boundaries, on understanding who belongs and who does not. He turned back to Emma, his mouth set in a hard line. And you, little girl, do not belong here. He moved forward then, reaching down to grasp Emma's thin upper arm with his manicured hand. His grip was firm, proprietary. The grip of someone removing an unwanted object from his space. Come along. I am escorting you out personally, and if I ever see you near this restaurant again, I will not hesitate to call the police. What Richard Sterling did not know, what none of the sneering staff or uncomfortable diners could possibly have guessed, was that the small girl whose arm he gripped so dismissively was Emma Catherine Thornton, the only child and heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country. Her father, Michael Thornton, had built a technology empire worth billions, his companies spanning software development, artificial intelligence research, and sustainable energy solutions. The Thornton name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, on scholarships and charitable foundations that touched thousands of lives. Emma lived in a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building, just 12 blocks from where she now stood. A home filled with more rooms than a child could ever need, and staff dedicated to her every comfort. But 6 months ago, Emma's world had shattered in a way that no amount of money could repair. Her mother, Catherine Thornton, had lost a brief but fierce battle with cancer, leaving behind a husband and daughter who loved her beyond measure. Catherine had been the moral compass of the Thornton family, the one who insisted that wealth came with responsibility, that privilege demanded compassion, that true character revealed itself in how people treated those who could offer them nothing in return. In her final weeks, as the illness claimed her strength bit by bit, Catherine had spent hours talking with Emma about the world and how it worked. She had held her daughter's small hand and spoken about kindness and cruelty, about how people often showed different faces depending on what they thought they could gain. Emma, my darling girl, Catherine had whispered one afternoon, her voice weak but urgent. Promise me you'll never forget that money and status are just accidents of birth. They don't make you better than anyone else. They just give you more responsibility to help. Emma had promised, tears streaming down her 7-year-old face, not fully understanding that her mother was saying goodbye. Catherine's final lesson had come just 3 days before she passed, when she was barely conscious but fought through the medication fog to tell Emma one more important thing. See how people treat those who can offer them nothing. Catherine had said, each word an effort. That's how you know their true heart. Not how they treat the powerful, but how they treat the powerless. Those words had haunted Emma in the months since her mother's death. She had watched people fawn over her father, over herself, knowing it was the Thornton name and fortune that drew their attention and respect. She wondered what those same people would do if they met her without knowing who she was, without the armor of wealth protecting her from the world's casual cruelties. 3 weeks ago, Emma had conceived her plan. She had taken clothing from a donation bin her father's foundation maintained, dressed herself carefully to look like a child in need, and slipped away from her bedroom. Richard's grip on Emma's arm tightened as he prepared to march her toward the exit. But a voice from across the dining room cut through the tension. Sterling, that's quite enough. The voice belonged to an elderly gentleman seated at table 12, a corner booth that offered a view of the entire restaurant. Harold Patterson was 82 years old, a retired federal judge who had been dining at Belmont's every Wednesday evening for the past 17 years. His white hair was neatly combed, and his navy suit, though not as flashy as Richard's, spoke of quiet quality and old money. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had spent decades weighing evidence and rendering judgments, and right now, those sharp gray eyes held clear disapproval. Richard's head snapped toward Mr. Patterson, surprise flashing across his features before he arranged them into an expression of professional courtesy strained by irritation. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but I am handling a situation that requires firm management. This child has no business being here. Mr. Patterson set down his wine glass with deliberate care and leaned forward slightly. She's a hungry child asking for work in exchange for food. You're treating her like she's committed some kind of crime. Don't you think you're being rather harsh? Et. His tone was gentle but carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Richard's jaw tightened, and he released Emma's arm only to straighten his burgundy tie once more. A gesture that seemed to restore his sense of authority. With all due respect, Mr. Patterson, maintaining the standards of this establishment is precisely what you and our other valued guests pay for. Part of my job is discernment, knowing who belongs here and who does not. It's one of the skills that makes Belmont's what it is. The word discernment was delivered with particular pride, as though Richard were describing a refined talent rather than simple prejudice. Mr. Patterson's expression hardened, disappointment settling into the lines around his mouth. I have been a patron of this restaurant for 17 years, Sterling. I have watched managers come and go, and I must say, I have never seen one treat a child with such cruelty and call it discernment. There is a difference between maintaining standards and maintaining basic human decency. Richard's face flushed deeper, caught between his desire to maintain his authority and his awareness that Mr. Patterson was exactly the kind of valued customer he claimed to be protecting. I am simply doing what is necessary to preserve the atmosphere that guests like yourself expect. Emma, still holding the glass of water Sarah had given her, looked up at Mr. Patterson with gratitude shining in her blue eyes. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Thank you for speaking up for me. Richard's face transformed from flush to something darker, his pride wounded by the public challenge to his authority. If Mr. Patterson thought he could undermine him in front of the entire dining room, he was mistaken. Richard squared his shoulders and addressed not just the elderly gentleman, but the entire restaurant, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an important lecture. You know what the real problem is? It's enablers. People with good intentions who think they're being kind by giving handouts to every person with a sad story. But what does that actually teach? It teaches that you don't have to work, don't have to earn anything, that you can just show up and someone will take care of you. He gestured broadly, warming to his theme. I am not being cruel. I am being realistic. I am maintaining the standards that separate establishments like Belmont's from common diners and fast food restaurants. Our guests come here expecting a certain experience, a certain atmosphere, and part of delivering that experience is ensuring that everyone present belongs here. Several diners nodded along with his words, finding comfort in his justification of their own discomfort with Emma's presence. Richard noticed these approving nods and drew strength from them, his confidence swelling. Standards matter, boundaries matter. And if that makes me the villain in this little drama, then so be it. I would rather be thought cruel than allow this establishment to decline into chaos. He turned back to Emma and reached down to grasp her thin arm once more, his fingers wrapping around her bicep with possessive authority. Now, we've wasted enough of everyone's time. Emma looked up at him, and in that moment, despite the tears that still threatened to fall, despite the humiliation and the hunger and the dozens of eyes watching her shame, she spoke with quiet dignity. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just hungry. The simplicity of the statement, the basic human need it expressed, might have moved someone with more compassion, but Richard had committed too deeply to his position, had made too public a stand to back down now. Then perhaps your parents should have taught you about responsibility instead of sending you out to beg. His voice was sharp and cold. The world doesn't owe you anything, little girl. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. Handouts don't help anyone. They create dependency, they remove incentive, they breed entitlement. He began walking toward the door, pulling Emma along beside him, and his face held an expression of smug satisfaction. He was doing the right thing, he told himself. He was protecting his restaurant, teaching this child a valuable lesson about how the world worked, and demonstrating to his staff and patrons that standards meant something at Belmont's. Let Mr. Patterson and his bleeding heart sensibilities think what they wanted. Richard Sterling knew his job, and he did it well. 3 steps from the door, Emma stopped. She planted her worn sneakers firmly on the plush carpet and pulled her arm free from Richard's grip with a gentle but unmistakable firmness that surprised him enough to make him release her. She turned to face him, and though she was small and he towered over her, though she was dressed in rags and he in expensive tailoring, something in that moment shifted the balance of power between them. Emma's voice when she spoke was quiet, but it carried through the restaurant with perfect clarity, reaching every table and every listening ear. Being poor doesn't make someone less human. The words hung in the air, simple and profound, delivered without anger or pleading, just a statement of fundamental truth. My mother taught me that every person has worth, no matter what they look like or what they're wearing or how much money they have. She taught me that how you treat people who can't do anything for you shows who you really are inside. Richard stared at her for a moment, genuinely taken aback by the articulate response from someone he had dismissed as nothing more than a street urchin. Then his face twisted into an expression of mocking amusement, and he laughed. It was a harsh sound, deliberately loud, designed to diminish the impact of her words and reassert his dominance. "Oh, how touching! The little beggar has learned to make speeches." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Did your mother also teach you that pretty words don't pay for meals? That restaurants are businesses, not charities? That feelings don't override reality?" He looked around at the watching diners, inviting them to share in his mockery, but the restaurant had gone completely silent. No one laughed with him, no one even moved. The quiet was profound, the kind of silence that falls when something important is happening and everyone knows it, even if they don't understand why. Forks rested on plates, wine glasses sat untouched. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes were fixed on the small girl and the man who loomed over her. Emma took a deep breath, the kind that steadies nerves and centers courage. She set the water glass carefully on a nearby table, her movements deliberate and controlled. Then she straightened her thin shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to walk out of Belmont's with whatever dignity she could preserve. She would not run. She would not cry. She would leave with her head high, just as her mother would have wanted. Richard watched her prepare to depart, and his smile held nothing but triumph. Through the large front windows of Belmont's, a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled smoothly to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights of Fifth Avenue. The vehicle was understated in its luxury. No flashy chrome or ostentatious details, just the quiet elegance of German engineering and considerable expense. It moved with the kind of precision that suggested a professional driver at the wheel, someone accustomed to navigating the demands of important passengers. Emma's eyes flickered toward the window, and for just a fraction of a second, something passed across her face. Not quite a smile, not relief exactly, but a subtle shift in her expression that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly, and her breathing steadied. Then her face returned to its previous neutral mask, giving nothing away to the man still lecturing above her. Richard had not noticed the car's arrival. He was too focused on Emma, too wrapped up in his own sense of righteousness to pay attention to anything happening outside his immediate sphere. "Let this be a lesson to you," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone imparting wisdom to the ignorant. "The world is not kind to people who don't understand their place in it. You cannot simply walk into establishments you have no business entering and expect people to accommodate you." The chauffeur stepped out from the driver's side, a man in his 50s wearing a crisp uniform with perfect posture that spoke of military training or long experience in formal service. He moved with efficient grace to the rear passenger door and opened it with a practiced motion. From the back seat emerged a tall man in his late 30s, unfolding his frame with easy confidence. He wore a suit of charcoal gray that was cut with such perfect precision it seemed almost casual in its perfection. The kind of tailoring that whispered rather than shouted wealth. The fabric moved with him like a second skin, and though there were no obvious designer labels or flashy details, anyone with knowledge of fine clothing would recognize that this suit cost more than most people earned in months. The man's brown hair was styled simply, and his face held a calm, thoughtful expression as his eyes immediately moved to the restaurant's windows. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, taking in the scene visible through the glass, and something in his jaw tightened. The atmosphere inside Belmont's began to shift in subtle ways. Several diners near the windows had noticed the arrival, their attention drawn by the impressive vehicle and the bearing of the man who emerged from it. A few exchanged glances, whispering to their companions. The brass-handled door opened again, and Michael Thornton stepped into Belmont's with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. He was 38 years old, tall and lean, with an athletic build that came from discipline rather than vanity. His charcoal gray suit was a masterpiece of understated elegance, tailored so precisely that it seemed to have been constructed around his exact frame, yet there was nothing ostentatious about it. The fabric had the subtle texture of the finest wool, and the cut suggested someone who understood that true luxury never needed to announce itself. His brown hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his face carried the quiet intelligence of someone who spent his days solving complex problems and building things that changed the world. But it was his eyes that drew attention, warm brown eyes that observed everything with careful attention, eyes that missed very little and judged even less. He had the presence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of brilliant people, yet he carried it lightly, without arrogance or need for validation. The moment Michael crossed the threshold, his gaze swept the dining room with practiced efficiency, and within seconds, he found exactly what he was looking for. His eyes locked onto Emma's small form near the entrance, taking in her threadbare dress, her tangled hair, the way she stood with careful dignity despite everything. Something flickered in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that suggested tightly controlled emotion, but he did not rush forward or call out. Instead, he began walking toward her with measured steps, his attention absorbing every detail of the scene before him. Richard had his back partially turned to the entrance, still focused on Emma and his lecturing, still riding the wave of his self-righteous authority. He had not yet registered the new arrival, too caught up in his moment of triumph to notice the shift happening around him. Several staff members had noticed, however, their expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion as they watched the well-dressed man approach. Sarah, still standing near the beverage station where she had retreated after giving Emma water, felt her breath catch in her throat. She recognized the man walking toward them, had seen his photograph in business magazines her economics professor sometimes brought to class. Michael Thornton, founder and chief executive of Thornton Technologies, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. She had read articles about his innovative approaches to artificial intelligence and his foundation's charitable work. What was he doing here? Why was he walking toward the little girl Richard was about to throw out? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, and then understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. Her hand came up to her mouth in shock. Michael's voice, when he spoke, was calm and gentle, pitched to carry just to Emma without alarming her further. "Emma, sweetheart, are you all right?" The concern in his tone was unmistakable, the voice of a parent who had been watching from a distance and finally stepped in when things had gone too far. Emma's carefully maintained composure cracked at the sound of that familiar, beloved voice. She turned and ran the few steps that separated them, and Michael knelt smoothly to catch her as she threw her small arms around his neck. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice finally breaking with all the emotion she had been holding back. She buried her face against his shoulder, and Michael's arms closed around her with protective strength, one hand cradling the back of her tangled blonde head. Richard Sterling's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The smug satisfaction drained away as if someone had pulled a plug, replaced by confusion that rapidly shifted toward something that looked like dawning horror. The color literally left his cheeks, his complexion going from flushed to pale in the space of seconds. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, no sound emerging. His eyes darted between Emma and the man holding her, his mind clearly racing to process what was happening and what it might mean. Michael stood slowly, Emma still in his arms, and turned his full attention to Richard for the first time. His warm brown eyes had gone cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who wielded real power and knew exactly how to use it. "What's happening here?" It was phrased as a question, but the tone made it clear he expected a complete and honest answer. Emma pulled back slightly from her father's shoulder, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I asked if I could sweep the floor for food, Daddy. Like we talked about, like Mommy said, to see how people treat those who can't offer them anything." Her voice was small but steady now, safe in her father's arms. "I told him I was hungry and I would work for a meal. But he said I was trying to scam them. He said I was a street urchin and I don't belong here." Michael's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple. His eyes never left Richard's face, watching as comprehension and panic fought for dominance in the manager's expression. Around them, the restaurant had gone absolutely silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different, charged with shock and the terrible anticipation of consequences about to unfold. Diners leaned forward in their seats, some with hands over their mouths. The realization was spreading like wildfire through the dining room, whispered names passing from table to table. Thornton. Michael Thornton. The billionaire. That's his daughter. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, his professional veneer cracking like thin ice under sudden weight. The carefully maintained mask of superiority shattered, revealing naked panic beneath. "Mr. Thornton, I didn't realize." The words came out as a stammer, his voice pitched higher than normal, stripped of all its previous condescension and authority. His hands came up in a gesture that was half placating, half defensive, and he took a step backward without seeming to realize he was doing it. Michael's expression remained cold, his brown eyes holding Richard's with an intensity that made the manager visibly shrink. "Didn't realize what?" Michael's voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "That she was human and deserving of basic dignity? That a hungry child asking to work for food deserves at least a kind word, if not actual help? Or did you just not realize that she had a father who would care about how she was treated?" The questions hung in the air, each one landing like a physical blow. Richard's face cycled through several shades of pale, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. I was just maintaining our standards, sir. We have policies about, I thought she was." His excuses tumbled out in fragments, half-formed justifications that died before completion, as he seemed to realize how hollow they sounded. "We get people trying to take advantage, and I have to protect the establishment, and the guests expect a certain—" His hands gestured helplessly, grasping for words that might save him. Around them, the other staff members were backing away from Richard as if his disgrace might be contagious. Jennifer, the hostess, had gone pale herself, remembering her whispered mockery to Marcus. Marcus stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, the color draining from his face as he comprehended the magnitude of what had just transpired. Sarah remained where she was, her hand still covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been vindication. At the tables, wealthy diners leaned toward each other, urgent whispers spreading through the room like wind through grass. "That's Michael Thornton, the tech billionaire. Thornton Technologies. His wife died, didn't she? Cancer, I think. That poor child. Oh my God, we just watched him humiliate Thornton's daughter." Several patrons pulled out their phones, though whether to document the moment or distance themselves from it was unclear. Michael shifted Emma slightly in his arms, settling her more comfortably against his hip, and turned his attention back to the assembled restaurant. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the dining room, and there was something in his tone that commanded absolute attention. "My wife Catherine passed away 6 months ago. Before she died, she spent a great deal of time teaching our daughter about the world, about kindness and cruelty, about how people reveal their true character." His voice caught slightly on Catherine's name, a momentary crack in his composure that showed the wound was still raw and deep. One of her final lessons was about how you can judge someone's true heart by observing how they treat people who can offer them nothing in return. Not how they treat the powerful or the wealthy or those who might benefit them, but how they treat those who appear weak or poor or vulnerable. Richard's face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were shaking visibly now. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out, his throat working uselessly as panic climbed higher in his chest. The full weight of what he had done was settling on him, and there was nowhere to hide from it, not with dozens of witnesses and Michael Thornton's steady gaze fixed upon him. Michael continued, his words measured and deliberate. My daughter wanted to test this lesson herself. She wanted to see firsthand how people would treat her when they thought she was nobody, when they believed she had nothing to offer, when she appeared to be just another poor child in need. So she dressed herself in old clothes, made herself look destitute, and came here to ask for work in exchange for food. He looked down at Emma, and his expression softened briefly with love and pride, before hardening again as he returned his attention to Richard. I followed at a distance, watching to see what would happen. I told myself I would intervene if necessary, if she was in any real danger, but I wanted to see how long it would take before someone showed her basic human kindness. His voice took on an edge of disappointment that was somehow worse than anger would have been. Instead, I watched as you publicly humiliated a 7-year-old child. I watched you mock her poverty, question her integrity, accuse her of running a scam. I watched you grab her arm and attempt to physically remove her from your establishment, all because she asked to sweep your floor in exchange for something to eat. Emma had gone quiet in her father's arms, her blue eyes fixed on Richard's face with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. She was watching his transformation with careful attention, seeing the way his smugness had evaporated, the way his authority had crumbled, the way he now stood trembling before consequences he had never imagined. Richard found his voice again, desperation lending him the strength to form words even as his world collapsed around him. Mr. Thornton, please, you have to understand, I was just maintaining our standards. That's my job. That's what I'm paid to do. How was I supposed to know? His voice climbed higher, edging toward panic. This is Belmont's. We have a reputation to uphold. We can't just let anyone walk in off the street. The owner expects me to protect the integrity of this establishment. Michael's expression remained unchanged, unmoved by the desperate justification. I happen to know the actual owner of this restaurant. The words were delivered quietly, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. Richard's eyes widened further. If such a thing were possible, David Morrison and I went to college together. We've been friends for 20 years. I've dined at this restaurant more times than I can count, though usually in the private dining room upstairs where people like you never see us. Richard swayed slightly on his feet, as though the floor had become unsteady beneath him. I was protecting the establishment. He tried again, his voice barely above a whisper now. I was doing what I thought was right for Belmont's reputation. Surely, Mr. Morrison would want me to. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Let's find out what David thinks about how you've been protecting his establishment, shall we? He scrolled through his contacts with his thumb, Emma still resting quietly against his other shoulder, watching everything with those observant blue eyes. Richard's hands came together in front of him in an unconscious gesture of pleading, but he seemed unable to form actual words anymore. Around them, the restaurant held its collective breath. Michael pressed the call button and raised the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a voice answered, cheerful and unsuspecting. Michael! What a surprise! How are you? David Morrison's voice was loud enough in the quiet restaurant that several nearby diners could hear it. David, I'm at Belmont's right now, Michael said, his voice carefully neutral. I need you to come down here immediately. There's a situation involving my daughter and your manager that requires your personal attention. The cheerfulness drained from David's voice instantly, replaced by concern and confusion. Emma, your manager did what? What happened? Is she hurt? Michael's eyes never left Richard's face as he spoke. She's not physically hurt, but I think you need to hear about how your establishment treats hungry children who ask for work. David Morrison walked through the doors of Belmont's less than 8 minutes after Michael's call, his face already set in lines of concern that deepened to shock and anger as he took in the scene. He was a man in his early 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of restaurant work, starting as a dishwasher at 16 and working his way up through every position until he finally owned his own establishment. He had built Belmont's reputation on excellence and hospitality and the sight of his old friend holding his daughter, while his manager stood pale and trembling, told him that something had gone terribly wrong in his restaurant. Michael, he said, moving quickly toward them. Then his eyes dropped to Emma, taking in her threadbare clothing and tangled hair. An understanding began to dawn. Emma. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. He turned to Richard, and his expression hardened into something cold and furious. Tell me what happened here. Now. Richard's attempted explanation came out in a tumbling rush of words, each excuse weaker than the last. He spoke of standards and policies, of protecting the establishment and maintaining atmosphere, of how he couldn't have known who she was. David listened with increasing disbelief and disgust, his jaw tightening with each word. When Richard finally fell silent, David shook his head slowly. You grabbed a child, a hungry child, who asked to work for food. You publicly humiliated her, mocked her poverty, and tried to throw her out onto the street. He turned to address the dining room, his voice carrying authority and genuine remorse. I want everyone here to know that this behavior does not represent Belmont's values. It never has, and it never will. He moved to Emma, kneeling down so he could look her in the eye as Michael set her gently on her feet. Emma, I am so deeply sorry for how you were treated in my restaurant. You deserved kindness and compassion, and instead you received cruelty. That is unacceptable. Emma nodded solemnly, and David stood, turning back to Richard with cold finality. This isn't even the first complaint I've received about your treatment of customers you deemed undesirable, Richard. There was the woman whose credit card was declined, and you had security escort her out before she could use a different card. The elderly man whose clothes smelled of mothballs who you seated in the back corner away from other guests. I overlooked those incidents. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. But this? He gestured toward Emma. This is beyond overlooking. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Michael remained standing in the center of the dining room. Emma now at his side with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He looked around at the assembled staff and diners, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned difficult lessons and wanted to share their meaning with others. I want to thank everyone here for bearing witness to what happened today. I know it was uncomfortable to watch. I know some of you felt uncertain about whether to intervene or remain silent. But what you saw tonight matters, and I hope you'll carry the lesson of it forward. He paused, gathering his thoughts, and his hand tightened slightly on Emma's shoulder. My wife Catherine believed deeply in the fundamental worth of every human being. She grew up in poverty herself, the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. She knew what it meant to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human because of circumstances beyond her control. When she and I met in college, she was working her way through school washing dishes in the cafeteria while I was there on my parents' money. His voice softened with memory and loss. She taught me that wealth and poverty are accidents of birth and fortune, nothing more. They don't make you better or worse as a person. They don't determine your worth or your humanity. What determines those things is how you treat others, especially those who cannot offer you anything in return. He looked down at Emma with unmistakable pride. When my daughter told me she wanted to conduct this experiment to test her mother's teachings in the real world, I was hesitant. She's only 7 years old. I wanted to protect her from the cruelty she might encounter, but she insisted, and I realized that Catherine would have been proud of her courage. So I followed at a distance, ready to step in if necessary, and I watched as my daughter learned a hard lesson about how the world treats those it deems powerless. Michael's gaze swept across the dining room, making eye contact with various diners who could not look away. Some of you watched her being humiliated and said nothing. Some of you nodded along when you were told she didn't belong here. Some of you pulled out your phones to document her shame rather than speaking up for her dignity. I'm not judging you for that. Fear of social discomfort is a powerful force, but I hope that next time you witness injustice, you'll remember this moment and find the courage to speak up. David Morrison stepped forward, his expression serious and determined. Michael is right. What happened here tonight reveals failures in how this establishment has been operating, and those failures stop now. Effective immediately, Belmont's will be implementing new policies and training programs focused on compassion and inclusivity. We will be partnering with local organizations to provide meals to those in need. Every member of my staff will undergo sensitivity training, and we will make it clear that discrimination based on appearance or perceived economic status will not be tolerated." He turned to look at Sarah, who still stood near the beverage station, her eyes wide. "Sarah, would you please step forward?" Sarah approached hesitantly, uncertainty written across her young face. David smiled at her, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since he arrived. "You showed kindness to Emma when no one else would. You brought her water and treated her with basic human decency despite knowing it might anger your supervisor. That's the kind of character I want representing Belmont's. You're promoted to senior server, effective immediately, with the corresponding raise in pay. And I'd like you to help develop our new training programs, if you're willing." Sarah's hand went to her mouth again, but this time in surprised joy rather than shock. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Yes, I'd be honored." Across the dining room, Mr. Patterson raised his wine glass in a small gesture of satisfaction, a smile playing at the corners of his weathered face. 3 months passed, and winter settled over the city with cold winds and early darkness. Belmont's restaurant had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. A sign near the entrance now advertised their community meal program, offering free dinners every Tuesday evening to anyone who needed them. No questions asked and no judgment offered. The staff wore small pins on their uniforms, showing they had completed the new sensitivity training. And the atmosphere in the dining room had shifted subtly toward something warmer and more welcoming. Richard Sterling's life had followed a very different trajectory. His termination from Belmont's had been immediate and public, and word spread quickly through the restaurant industry. No upscale establishment would hire him after what had happened, and his attempts to explain or justify his actions only made things worse. He lost his apartment when he could not make rent, spent 2 weeks sleeping in his car, and finally swallowed his pride enough to seek help at a homeless shelter on the East Side. It was there, serving meals to the very people he had once dismissed as unworthy, that Richard began to truly see what he had become. He watched families struggling to maintain dignity while accepting charity. He saw children with Emma's same hunger in their eyes. He listened to stories of job losses and medical emergencies and simple bad luck that had pushed good people into desperate circumstances. Slowly, painfully, his perspective shifted. He volunteered at the shelter, then took a paid position as their intake coordinator. On a cold Thursday evening in December, Richard stood in the lobby of the Thornton Foundation offices, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, his expensive suits long since sold. His hair, no longer professionally styled, was cut simply and showed more gray than it had 3 months earlier. He had asked for this meeting, had spent weeks gathering the courage to reach out. Emma came down to the lobby with her father, and Richard felt his throat tighten when he saw her. She wore a warm blue dress, and her blonde hair was neatly braided. She looked healthy and cared for, everything a child should be, and the memory of how he had treated her burned in his chest. "Mr. Sterling," Emma said quietly, and her voice held no anger, only curiosity. Richard knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level as he should have done that first night. "Emma, I came here to apologize to you. Not because I want anything or because I hope your father might help me find work, but because you deserve to hear that I was wrong." His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "I was cruel to you when you needed kindness. I judged you based on how you looked. Instead of seeing you as a human being who was hungry and asking for help, I let my pride and my prejudices turn me into someone who could hurt a child and feel justified doing it." Tears gathered in his eyes. "Your mother was right about how people reveal their true character. That night, you saw the worst of mine. I'm sorry. I'm deeply, truly sorry." Emma looked at Richard for a long moment, and then she reached out and placed her small hand on his shoulder. "I forgive you, Mr. Sterling. My mom used to say that people can change if they want to badly enough. I think you wanted to change." Richard nodded, unable to speak, and Emma continued with a wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 7 years. "You know what I learned that night? I learned that my mom was right about everything. People do show who they really are by how they treat people who can't help them. But I also learned that sometimes people need to see themselves clearly before they can become better. You saw yourself that night, and you didn't like what you saw. That's the first step. In the months that followed, Emma continued her work with the Thornton Foundation, helping her father distribute resources to those in need and visiting programs that served vulnerable populations. Catherine's legacy lived on through her daughter's compassionate heart and through the changes her final lesson had sparked. Belmont's restaurant thrived under its new inclusive policies, becoming known not just for excellent food, but for its commitment to human dignity. The community meal program served hundreds of people each month, and other restaurants began implementing similar initiatives. Sarah completed her training and became a voice for compassionate service throughout the industry. The ripple effect of that one night continued to spread outward in ways both large and small. On a Saturday morning in spring, Emma stood in the kitchen of a community center, helping to serve breakfast to families who needed it. She wore an apron over her jeans and smiled at each person who came through the line, seeing them not as poor or wealthy, not as deserving or undeserving, but simply as human beings who needed a meal and deserved to be treated with dignity. Richard worked beside her, having joined the foundation's volunteer program, and together they served food and offered kindness to people who had once been invisible to him. Emma's voice carried clearly as she handed a plate to an elderly woman. Everyone deserves to be treated like they matter, because they do. The lesson her mother had taught her, the lesson she had tested that cold autumn night at Belmont's, had become the guiding principle of her young life. How we treat those who appear to have nothing reveals everything about who we truly are. Kindness costs nothing but means everything, and every person, regardless of what they wear or where they come from or how much money they possess, deserves to be seen as fully human and worthy of compassion. The choice of how we treat others belongs to each of us, every single day.